Did you ever think the person who gave you life could also be the one to walk away right when you needed her most? The day my mother left felt like the air had been sucked out of the house, as though even the walls understood something was terribly wrong. My father was gone forever, and she decided she had to be gone too, just not in the same way. That empty space in our lives became a wound, raw and festering, every time we remembered how things used to be. Those memories have a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. A photograph, a song on the radio, even the smell of coffee in the early morning hours. They all trigger recollections of a time when our family was whole, brimming with laughter and love. But once Dad passed, and Mom traveled to her home country, it was like waking up in a house that wasn't truly a home anymore. If you want to know how something like that can echo through your life decades later, keep listening, because what happened next goes beyond just childhood pain and leads into a tangled web of resentment, secrets, and unexpected twists that still affect me today. Because the greatest shock of all isn't just that my mother abandoned us back then, it's the way she now tries to shape the narrative, turning her struggles into excuses for everything she did, and even attacking my wife for not bowing down to her version of the truth. What began as a painful childhood experience has morphed into a full-blown family saga, complete with hushed whispers, pointed accusations, and a jaw-dropping confrontation you won't see coming. Stay with me, because this story has enough revelations to keep you guessing at every turn. My father's death wasn't a quiet slipping away, but an abrupt, heart-shattering moment that ripped the ground out from under our feet. One day, his laughter rumbled through the living room, making the walls vibrate with happiness. The next, he was gone, leaving my 10-year-old mind awash in confusion and sorrow. It was the kind of experience that rewrites your entire perspective on life in a single night, leaving you in a limbo where nothing makes sense and everything hurts. When you're a child, you look to your parents for stability. They're your compass in a world that often feels vast and unpredictable. Losing Dad shattered that compass. Mom became distant, worn down by a sorrow that seemed to settle in her bones. Gone was the lively woman who cooked elaborate family dinners and teased us about our silly jokes. In her place was a stranger, consumed by grief, her eyes dull with resignation. But that was just the beginning. She thought moving back to her home country would help her heal from the heartbreak. She said it was temporary, that she'd return once she found peace. Yet days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before we knew it, Mom only showed up a handful of times, as though visiting from a far-off land, distant not just in miles but in spirit. The truth is, her decision to leave came with its own hidden layers, some of which wouldn't come to light until much later. And once they did, they changed the way I saw my mother forever. With Mom gone, my sister and I found ourselves under the guardianship of the Nelsons, family friends who tried their best to fill the void. They were good people, kind, attentive, and loving in that neighborly way. Their house, though, felt too orderly, too perfect, a constant reminder that we weren't in our own home anymore. Each night, I lay awake, staring at the foreign patterns on the ceiling, missing the small cracks and chipped paint of my old bedroom that had once felt so familiar. I remember Mrs. Nelson coming into the makeshift room we shared, her voice soft. "Are you doing okay tonight?" The question felt loaded, like there was no easy answer. The truth was, I wasn't okay, and I wouldn't be for a long time. But I nodded, because telling her how uprooted I felt, how much I wished for my mother's embrace, seemed like too big a burden to throw at someone who was already taking on more than she'd signed up for. Over time, the Nelsons became a patch for the gaping hole left in our family life, but the sense of abandonment only festered underneath. And that was the irony. My mother's departure was partly an attempt to escape the pain of losing Dad, but in doing so, she unleashed another kind of pain, one that cut me in ways I'm still learning to articulate. There were days I wondered if I had done something wrong. Was I too loud, too much trouble, too stubborn? Maybe if I had been quieter or more obedient, she would have stayed. Those thoughts gnawed at my young mind, setting the stage for a lifelong battle with self-doubt. Yet the biggest revelations were still to come, and they would shock me more than the initial abandonment ever could. Years later, I found myself in a college lecture hall, drifting in and out of focus as an economics professor droned on about supply, and demand. That's when I noticed her, my future wife, scribbling notes in a way that made me think she was more interested in turning the lecture into art than actually recording the professor's points. She had a quiet confidence that drew me in, a magnetic presence I felt before I understood what it was. Coffee meetups turned into late-night study sessions, which turned into dinners and deeper conversations. One summer evening, as the sky painted itself in orange and lavender, I finally told her about the father I lost, the mother who left, and the patchwork childhood I pieced together in the Nelsons' home. Her reaction was a revelation. No pity, no awkward stares, just genuine empathy. She listened intently, asked questions without prying, and her hand in mine felt like the first real anchor I'd had in a long time. That was when I realized something had shifted in me. I could breathe easier, unafraid that my painful past would scare her away. Instead, she shared her own stories of loss, albeit different from mine, but still enough to show me she understood the lonely spaces heartbreak can leave behind. I remember thinking, this is the woman who sees me, not just my scars. Little did I know, the very aspects that made her my safe haven would become a source of tension later on. Because when she met my mother, both of those worlds, my battered childhood and my wife's lavish upbringing, collided in ways no one anticipated. From the moment my wife first stepped into my family's orbit, I sensed an underlying friction that was hard to place. She was raised in an environment of privilege, large estates, exclusive education, and inherited wealth that demanded constant attention even after her parents passed away. Despite her background, she carried herself with grace, never flaunting her money or looking down on anyone. She'd bring thoughtful gifts to family gatherings, choose personal items over flashy extravagance, and do her best to fit in with my more modest roots. But for my mother and aunt, the very existence of that wealth was a flashing neon sign. It didn't matter that my wife was respectful and warm, or that she was trying to bridge the gap. They seemed to see her through a lens tinted with envy and preconceived notions. To them, she was an outsider, a representation of everything that under owned struggles and insecurities. It didn't help that my mother still wrestled with guilt about her own parenting decisions, and my aunt had a sharp tongue and an even sharper memory of old grievances. This quiet tension, like a gas leak, built up behind the scenes, almost unnoticeable until a single spark would be enough to set it all ablaze. And believe me, it did. The comments started small, little jabs about her clothes being too fancy, or her preference for a certain type of wine. Over time, those barbs grew sharper, morphing into a narrative that she considered herself superior. My wife, in turn, withdrew, refusing to engage in battles that felt unwinnable. That standoffishness was interpreted as snobbery by my mom and aunt, fueling an escalating cycle of criticism and misunderstanding. What no one knew yet was that the real explosion was just around the corner. Fast forward to a visit back to my mother's home. My wife couldn't make it. Her corporate law career was demanding her full attention, and she felt it would be better if the kids and I spent uninterrupted time with their grandmother. At first, it seemed like a perfect arrangement to ease tensions. Mom would bond with the grandchildren without the underlying friction, but old resentments have a way of bubbling to the surface when left unchecked. One quiet evening, as my aunt and mother shared a bottle of wine, I heard my wife's name float through the air, followed by the word snob. The accusation hit me like a gust of icy wind. My wife, who had taken pains to be polite and respectful, was being branded as arrogant, as if her every step was a reminder that she wasn't one of them. Rage simmered under my skin as I listened to them describe her distance as contempt, her politeness as condescension. It felt like a betrayal, a direct insult not just to her but to the love and effort we both put into maintaining these familial bonds. When my mother caught sight of me standing there, the atmosphere crackled. Silence fell, heavier than any words could have been. My aunt tried to wave it off as a slip of the tongue, but the damage was done. In that moment, something in me snapped. I confronted them, maybe more heatedly than I should have, and the comfortable veneer of family warmth peeled away, revealing old grudges, unresolved guilt, and a sense of entitlement that left me speechless. What they didn't realize was that they'd pushed me to a point of no return. I would have defended my wife no matter what, but now I was doing it out of a sense of fundamental betrayal. The morning after that disastrous confrontation was filled with a tense hush. My aunt tried to pretend nothing had happened, offering me coffee and asking about the kids with a forced smile. My mother looked at me with pleading eyes, as though hoping for an instant fix, an apology that would sweep the ugliness under the rug. But as I sipped that bitter coffee, my mind was already made up. I wasn't going to stay in a place where the woman I love, who tried so hard to integrate herself, was casually dismissed. I told my mother we'd be leaving early, and her reaction wavered between anger and sorrow. "When will I see my grandchildren again?" she asked. The question tore at me, but I held firm. Respect is a two-way street, and if they weren't willing to walk in my wife's shoes, I couldn't force her or my children to endure a hostile environment. I booked flights for the next day, only telling my wife via a quick text that I'd explain once I was back. The hours leading up to our departure were surreal, like moving through a dream where every gesture felt loaded with meaning. My aunt offered the kids sweets. My mother tried to hug me goodbye. But there was no escaping the truth. I was leaving not just because of a single heated argument, but because it made me realize how deep the distrust and disrespect ran. As we pulled away in the taxi, I wondered what new revelations might emerge from this rift. Little did I know, there were still secrets tangled in the background, waiting to come to light and redefine everything I thought I knew about my family. Returning home felt like a breath of fresh air, but the emotional toll of that trip lingered. I tried to settle back into normal life, taking the kids to school, resuming my own work schedule, and enjoying quiet evenings with my wife. Yet, something gnawed at me. It was an intuition that I hadn't yet heard the full story behind my mother's decision to leave years ago. Had it really been just grief that drove her away? Or were there other reasons, ones she never admitted? That question led me down a path of quiet investigation. I spoke with a few older relatives on my father's side, people who had witnessed the dynamic between my parents before Dad passed. Whispers surfaced of old arguments about finances, rumors of possible infidelity, and lingering bitterness over family inheritance that might have put extra strain on their marriage. One cousin even hinted that my father had suspected my mother of wanting to relocate long before his passing, as though she were planning an escape. I didn't know what to believe, but every tidbit painted a picture of a marriage far more complicated than I'd been led to think. And then came the bombshell. A distant aunt revealed that after my father's death, certain accusations surfaced suggesting my mother had mismanaged some of his estate or had taken financial steps behind his back. There was no solid evidence, just enough rumors to cast a dark shadow. Could these rumors have contributed to her decision to flee to her home country, away from the questions and possible legal tangles? It was a shocking revelation, and it made me question everything. Was my mother's abandonment purely emotional, or was it a strategic move to avoid scrutiny? If so, what did that say about her claims of being misunderstood and mistreated? Sitting in my living room late at night, I thought about my father's final days, the cracks in my parents' relationship, and how all these puzzle pieces fit together. The more I learned, the more I understood why my wife's presence, confident, independent, unwavering, might unnerve my mother. My wife demands accountability, both at work and in her personal life. She doesn't shy away from questions, and she refuses to accept partial truths. Perhaps my mother sensed that if she opened up around my wife, she'd have to come clean about more than just grief. In the months since the confrontation, I've spoken to my mother multiple times on the phone. She's never directly addressed the rumors, never offered any explanation that might clear the air. Instead, she focuses on her loneliness, her health, and her desire to see her grandchildren. Sometimes I wonder if she's hiding more, or if she's merely trying to shield herself from further judgment. Whatever the case, the boundary I set remains firm. Until she respects my wife, and by extension, our family, I can't allow her back into our life on the same terms as before. And so, here we are, caught between wanting to reconcile and the need to protect our peace. The situation remains tense, with new details still drifting to the surface, each adding another layer of complexity. But maybe that's how it goes with family secrets. They unravel slowly, forcing you to confront the possibility that the people you love can also hurt you deeply. Will we find closure? Possibly. But for now, I've learned that sometimes you must stand your ground, even against your own blood, to preserve the stability you've worked so hard to build. It's a lesson in heartbreak, resilience, and the staggering weight of decisions made in the shadows of grief. After my wife and I returned to our regular routine, I received a cryptic email from a name I didn't recognize. It claimed to have information about my father's last weeks, evidence that might exonerate or incriminate my mother. Though skeptical, I followed the thread, discovering references to hospital visits and financial documents I'd never seen. It was all too unclear, but it sparked yet another wave of doubt. Was my mother not just grieving, but also overwhelmed by a deeper scandal involving my father's estate? Did she leave partly to dodge questions about potential money mishandling or to hide additional debts? Digging further, I learned that Dad had some unfulfilled promises to distant relatives overseas, possibly linked to a family inheritance that never got fully disclosed. These relatives felt slighted, believing my mother was part of a scheme to keep them from receiving what they were owed. Nothing was proved, but the suspicion alone was enough to breed bitterness. Suddenly, the emotional scars of my father's passing and my mother's abandonment were overshadowed by the possibility that they had both been caught in a web of conflicting financial interests. Imagining my mother's mental state at the time, widowed, accused, overwhelmed, gave me pause. Could that series of events have broken her spirit, leading her to believe she couldn't remain in the country without facing more anguish? The more I uncovered, the less I found myself able to draw a clear line between victims and perpetrators. Was my mother the villain who coldly left us behind? Or was she a desperate woman fleeing a situation too complex for her to handle alone? Every conversation with my wife led us deeper into speculation, her attorney's mind racing through all the possible scenarios, me trying to reconcile it with the image of my once loving mother. If you think that's complicated, just wait. Because as soon as I started asking direct questions, my mother's home country relatives chimed in with even more perplexing stories. It turns out that Mom had her own traumas. A sibling of hers confided in me that, long before Dad passed, my mother suffered from bouts of anxiety so severe she'd lock herself away for days, refusing to speak to anyone. These episodes worsened when my father's health declined. People in her hometown whispered that she was never the same after witnessing certain tragedies in her own youth. Tragedies that involved extended family feuds and legal battles that drained everyone emotionally. Perhaps losing Dad just tipped her over the edge, making escape feel like the only option. Whatever the truth, her life in her home country was far from idyllic. She struggled to find work, faced social stigma as a widow, and according to some accounts, became entangled in property disputes that drained her finances. Hearing all this made me see her in a more nuanced light, though it didn't erase the hurt she caused my sister and me. Still, my wife's perspective remained. None of that justified leaving children behind. And in a way, I couldn't disagree. Understanding Mom's pain didn't negate the damage her absence did. More and more, I realized that the messy intersections of grief, economic hardship, and poor decisions aren't easily untangled. My mother might have made the wrong call, but she was operating in a storm of emotions and external pressures. The question was, how do I help her see that blaming my wife or feeling attacked by my wife's mere presence was unjustified? And how do I maintain boundaries to keep my family safe from further emotional harm, especially if Mom won't address her own demons? In the wake of this deep dive into my family's skeletons, my aunt took on a more aggressive stance. She started calling me directly, accusing me of being brainwashed by my wife, claiming that if it weren't for her, I would be more forgiving toward Mom. Each phone call left me shaking with anger. My aunt's logic seemed twisted, as though my desire to protect my wife meant I hated my own mother. She completely missed the point that both love and resentment can coexist, that I could empathize with my mother's struggles yet still demand respect for my wife's boundaries. The more combative my aunt got, the more determined I became not to bend. I'd seen the damage caused by hush-hush family secrets and false niceties. If a real resolution was to happen, it couldn't involve tiptoeing around the truth or ignoring the blame games. What made it more complicated was how my mother sometimes echoed my aunt's sentiments in less direct ways, hinting that my wife was the reason I'd closed off to family ties. That narrative, that my wife had orchestrated a wedge, was the very thing that drove us further apart. Because if they couldn't acknowledge that the wedge began years ago with my mother's choices, how could we ever move forward? This tension with my aunt also started affecting my kids in small ways. They heard part of a heated phone call and my daughter asked, "Why is Auntie so angry at Mommy?" Trying to explain adult conflicts to children is heartbreaking. I found myself sugarcoating details, unwilling to burden them with the full weight of generational rifts and leftover bitterness. Yet every soft lie or half-truth weighed on me, reminding me of how quickly old patterns of secrecy can reemerge. It became clear. If the older generation didn't handle things properly, the cycle of misunderstanding and resentment might just pass down to the next. Back home, my wife listened to my updates with a level-headedness that both impressed and frustrated me. She was unwavering. "I will not stand in the way if you want a relationship with your mom, but I won't subject myself or our children to a toxic environment." Part of me admired her clarity, another part felt torn. It was my family, after all. But I realized she was right. Her willingness to separate my bond with my mother from her own personal boundaries was a gift, not an ultimatum. She wasn't asking me to cut ties, just to ensure those ties didn't strangle our peace. Meanwhile, my mother continued to call, voicing a subdued sadness each time. I could hear regret in her voice, but rarely an admission of wrongdoing. She'd ask about the kids, ignore the subject of my wife unless I brought it up, and pivot the conversation to her own loneliness. Some calls ended with me feeling guilty for being so firm. Others ended with me feeling even stronger in my resolve. The duality was exhausting, and it made me realize that forging a new path forward would require more than just phone calls. It might need professional intervention, family counseling, or at least some mediated talks. But given my mother's personality, I wasn't sure she'd ever agree to that. In these moments of doubt, I found myself leaning on my wife's emotional support more than ever. She reminded me that love and loyalty don't have to mean blind acceptance of harmful behavior. We can love someone from a distance, if being too close brings more pain than healing. But it's never that simple in practice. How do you distance yourself from the woman who gave you life, even if she's also the one who caused you lasting hurt? That question haunted me nightly, reminding me that the hardest part of adulthood is sometimes learning that the people we idolized as children can be deeply flawed. While all this took place, my kids were growing fast. They started asking about Grandma more, curious why they hadn't seen her in a while, especially after the short trip that ended abruptly. I told them she lived far away, which was true, but the older one pressed, "But can't we just take a plane again?" This innocent question underscored heartbreak. Of course we could, technically, but not without immersing them in the very conflict we were trying to shield them from. My wife and I discussed letting them video chat with Grandma, setting short calls supervised by me, so there was no chance of backhanded comments or manipulation. It was a compromise, but one that felt uneasy, like walking a tightrope of caution. This attempt to maintain some semblance of a relationship without fully reconciling put a strain on everything. One video call ended awkwardly when my aunt suddenly appeared in the background, making disapproving faces. My kids noticed, and when they asked about it afterward, I told them Auntie was just being silly. That half-lie again. I wondered, how many half-lies does it take before you lose your own sense of honesty? Yet the biggest shock was yet to emerge, and it came in a roundabout way. A cousin from my mother's side reached out, someone who rarely spoke to me. He claimed that my aunt's resentment might not just be about money or class differences. It could be linked to something deeper involving a land dispute in the old country, where apparently my wife's success and perceived legal knowledge might threaten the final outcome. The cousin suggested my aunt feared my wife would meddle or encourage me to meddle in matters that could cost them a significant inheritance. Suddenly, all the pieces began to line up. The hostility, the snob accusations, the paranoid references to my wife's job. If true, it wasn't just personal. They believed my wife posed a direct risk to their financial ambitions. This revelation changed the game. Perhaps my mother's distance was partly fueled by financial complications and her sister's influence. If there was indeed an inheritance at stake, it might explain why they spoke so venomously when they thought I couldn't hear. They might see my wife's involvement, no matter how indirect, as a threat to the assets they considered rightfully theirs. It was an ugly thought, but it made sense. The question then was, how much of this did my mother endorse, and how much was solely my aunt's paranoia? Grappling with this new perspective, I felt torn between fury and heartbreak. On one hand, the idea that my family could manipulate or push me away over money felt vile. On the other, it gave me a twisted form of relief. It wasn't purely that they hated my wife. They might be afraid of losing something tangible, something they believed my wife could legally unravel. The moment I told my wife this theory, she rolled her eyes in that calm, measured way. "I don't even know what inheritance they're talking about. I have zero interest in meddling," she said, shaking her head. Yet the damage was already done. Perception, often, is more powerful than reality, especially in families. Now I was in deeper than ever. The family drama that started with my mother's grief had grown roots into finances, property disputes, and paranoid speculation. Where would it end? Would confronting my aunt with this knowledge help, or just escalate the hostility? Every option felt fraught with potential explosions. Still, I refused to be manipulated. I resolved that if they wanted to hold on to their illusions, they could, but they would do so without dragging my wife's name through the mud. As the months wore on, I decided to find some semblance of peace within myself. Therapy, although I initially resisted the idea, crept back onto my radar. Maybe talking to a professional could help me sort out the jumbled threads of love, resentment, guilt, and loyalty that tied my life in knots. My wife wholeheartedly supported it, but I hesitated. It felt like one more way to pick at a scab I was trying to let heal. Ultimately, I recognized that ignoring wounds doesn't heal them. It only festers the infection. I made a conscious choice to shift focus to my immediate family. My children and wife deserved my energy, my love, and my attention. Yes, I still called my mother every so often, checking on her health, listening to her stories about life back home. But the calls were shorter, more formal, lacking the warmth we once had. My aunt was usually conspicuously absent from these phone calls, which was a relief. Occasionally, I'd feel a pang of guilt at how distant we'd become, but then I'd recall the venomous words spoken behind our backs. That memory, as painful as it was, steeled my resolve to maintain strong boundaries. People often say blood is thicker than water, but I've come to realize that the relationships we cultivate with respect and understanding can mean far more than shared DNA. It's not that I've disowned my mother or my aunt. I still love them deeply in ways only a son and nephew can. However, love without accountability is just enabling. In this ongoing saga, accountability is the missing link. And until it's found, I'll continue to protect my wife and children from any toxicity that might seep through the cracks of old resentments and unspoken grudges. Even with everything that's happened, I've discovered a surprising capacity in myself for forgiveness. Over time, we humans learn that holding on to anger only makes the wounds deeper. I do forgive my mother for her abandonment, understanding that she was swept up in grief, possibly complicated by hidden financial storms. I forgive my aunt for her bitterness, suspecting she's clinging to tangible assets to fill some emotional void. Forgiveness, however, doesn't mean I forget or let my guard down. It simply means I'm choosing not to let their choices poison my own journey. Now, we find ourselves in a tentative ceasefire. I haven't ruled out another visit, but it would come with clear conditions: honesty, respect for my wife, and an agreement that no more backhanded remarks fly. Whether they can abide by that remains uncertain. My mother says she understands, but she hasn't given me any concrete sign that she's addressed her sister's behavior. The children are growing older, more perceptive, and I don't want them absorbing the negativity of grown-up conflicts. So for now, we wait in this limbo, hoping that with each passing day, the lessons we've learned can guide us toward a healthier family dynamic. And that might be the most shocking truth of all. Sometimes the people we expect to protect us are the ones who shatter our sense of safety. But from those fragments, you can build something stronger if you're willing to confront the heartbreak, lay down firm boundaries, and acknowledge that love and disappointment can coexist. For anyone out there facing a similar dilemma, know this: it's not betrayal to defend your spouse, your children, and yourself from harm, even if that harm comes from your own flesh and blood. In the end, those tough choices may lead you to a place of deeper peace, one forged by honesty rather than haunted by secrets. If there's one overarching lesson in this long, winding story, It's that family bonds can stretch across continents, across differences in class and upbringing, and even across decades of misunderstandings. But respect is the foundation. Without it, every reunion, every phone call, every holiday visit turns into a minefield. My wife, through her quiet resolve and unwavering support, taught me the power of drawing a line to protect the peace we've built. It's a lesson I learned the hard way, shaped by the memory of a mother who left when life got too heavy and an aunt who'd rather whisper conspiracies than extend an olive branch. Sometimes, growth doesn't look like a heartfelt reconciliation or a dramatic family gathering where old wounds magically heal. Sometimes it looks like small steps, like shorter phone calls, more transparent conversations, and setting clear boundaries your family can't ignore. And in those incremental moves, you might discover a kind of healing that doesn't erase the past, but allows you to move forward without being chained to it. So here we stand, still hopeful for the day we can gather around a table, share a meal, and let the bitterness dissolve into genuine love and mutual understanding. Until that day arrives, my priority remains clear. Nurture the family my wife and I have created, shield our children from harm, and hold on to the promise that no matter how dark the past, we always have a choice in how we shape the future. If you've ever felt torn between loyalty to the family who raised you and the family you've built on your own terms, you already know how agonizing such decisions can be. Yet every hard choice can be a step toward freedom. Freedom from guilt, from the weight of unresolved grievances, and from the fear that you'll repeat the very patterns you once despised. And that, more than anything, is why I stand by my decision. Sometimes, you have to break the cycle to protect what matters most. And sometimes, it's the very act of breaking that cycle that sets you on the path to real forgiveness, one measured by honesty and respect, not by empty words or forced smiles.